Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. I'm super stoked because today I'm going to talk about a book that I think is very influential to me, that I recently read, and that I think is super fascinating and worth talking about. And that is the book High Conflict by Amanda Ripley, which was actually a book that I discovered from Big Think, which is on YouTube, and which features interviews with a variety of journalists and writers and thinkers and intellectuals, and included Amanda Ripley. The reason why this topic is so close to me is because it features a topic that I think about a lot, which is that of conflict. When I think of conflict, I think of always wanting to mediate that conflict. I think of always wanting to resolve that conflict. And while we know for sure that there are different orientations to the world, which means that there are different worldviews and different personalities and temperaments, it means that some people do not want to resolve the conflict, and it means that conflict is sometimes even the point. Sometimes even contention, or in worst case scenarios, violence. But I think it's very interesting to think about nonetheless, because it focuses on conflict as I understand it, and as an individual reader can understand it, which I think is interesting, and I think Amanda Ripley does a good job talking about it. Now, I'm really excited to share some of the ideas in this book. There's a lot to unpack, and I want to engage with the ideas in a way that I hope is expressive and I would describe analytical. So the first thing I want to describe that I think that she talks about that I think is really helpful is the idea of looping. And looping is interesting because I don't know that it's necessarily her concept specifically. I think it's something that she has understood and something that she articulates in this book, but it's also called looping for understanding. And the idea is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. You can even look it up on the internet, looping for understanding, and it should pull up a summary of what it means to be able to follow the steps. But basically, to make a long story short, with looping, or looping for understanding, you try to mediate conflict by nipping it in the bud. And you do this by being on the same page as someone else. So when someone says something that we disagree with, or that we don't like, or that we want to push back against, we tend to not be listening. We tend to not listen to each other. In fact, I believe Amanda Ripley in this book actually described how a lot of people don't even listen to each other. A lot of people feel as though they aren't being listened to. And so with looping for understanding, you have this ability to show that you're at least hearing what someone has said. And this is good, and I think can even be disarming, because you're allowing yourself to listen to what they're saying in real time, but you're also showing this person that you are listening. And I think that this is a great idea. Now, what you do is very straightforward. You just repeat what they said in your own terms, in your own words. And you do this in order to try to understand what they're saying, but understand what they're saying from your own perspective. And the reason why this is important is because if the other person feels heard, they might say something like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And you always want to double check and make sure that what they're saying is what they're actually saying. So you might follow up with something like, so what I hear you saying is, and this individual can confirm whether or not that's actually true. And if that's what they're saying, and if they're wrong, if you're wrong, I should say, then you want to correct yourself and be able to share the idea that you're still listening and continue to try to iterate what they are saying in your own words. Now, the other part of this is that you don't necessarily have to agree with them, but looping for understanding is allowing space for a person to be heard. And it allows space for that peace. I think it's really difficult and complicated in today's society because it does seem as if there's a lot of contention and controversy. It does seem as though we are talking past each other. So I think, even though it's counterintuitive, I think it makes sense to just pause, and before you respond, you just make sure that you're on the same page, that you understand what the other person is saying. Now, there's more to this process. I encourage you to look it up for yourself or check out this book, High Conflict. I encourage you to check it out yourself. But the point that I want to illustrate is that I've noticed in my own life when I get in arguments or problem discussions, you could say, this is because I am not looping. And I actually find looping to be very counterintuitive, mostly because it's not really what I would have expected to say. my general tendency is to actually get defensive. And I think it's really interesting that this is such a deeply rooted thing of human nature, that we have a hard time capturing a sense of what the other person is saying, and that we have a really hard time being aware of what we are saying to each other. And so, while I want to acknowledge that this skill is very difficult, you have to practice it, you have to pause and really implement it, something that I will admit I've struggled to do, that I think that it is a valuable tool. And I think it's something to keep in your back pocket and to keep on the back burner. Because you never know how you can change a course by thinking about what someone is saying, by looping for understanding, and by being someone who listens to what the other person is saying. I think that this is incredibly helpful in a time where things are very contentious and controversial and problematic. I think this skill is very important. Now, that captures looping, but there are a couple more concepts I want to talk about with high conflict, and I want to talk about them because I think that they are counterintuitive. I think that they make sense, and I think that they're very well articulated, but I have a little bit of a critique of some of the thoughts, even though I'm passionate about them, and I want to share that. But first, let me share a few things that Amanda Ripley writes about in her book. So first off, she talks about social rejection, and she basically has this model where she says that with social rejection, which is basically when people are rejected by others, we have this tendency to placate. So if we are the ones being rejected, of course we placate. But then the next step after the kind of fawning is definitely anger. And she's very interesting because she frames it as this step from the placation to the continued rejection, which then moves to anger and possibly even violence, is what leads to the violence. And I'm a little bit troubled because what do you do when rejection is a part of life? When groups and people and individuals and societies and cultures are rejected? When ideas are rejected? When people experience their contrast between many different groups and individuals in the world? And I want to just articulate that I struggle with that realization. It doesn't always make sense to know what to do if that is the case, because it's not really clear what you do to be able to challenge that rejection. Now, as a side note, I do think she actually identifies some of those points, and I think that it's fair to say that maybe I've missed some of those points, but I'm also just going off my interpretation and what I understand about the book. And in my mind, I'm kind of left hanging. I'm kind of left wondering with the social rejection, like, well, how do you foster an environment of a place where people are not rejected, at least so harshly, when rejection is just a part of life? I mean, I can give you an example, like being a writer and musician has led to where I've been rejected a lot. I've been rejected a lot because of my neurodivergence. And so when I think about these things, I look at it because I'm just like, I don't know that you can avoid it. People don't always like you. They don't always like what you're doing, and I don't want that to mean that I'm going to become angry and violent. Sure, it makes me angry and I feel hurt, and I have to work on those things in therapy, for instance. But I don't necessarily think that it's fair to say that the conclusion is always going to be some kind of violence or disruption. And I get the argument. I do want to say I understand the argument, because she's saying that those disruptions are what we're trying to avoid. And so it's being aware of it. But I just really worry about the conclusion, because I think the framing might limit the other possibilities of how we can cope with rejection and how we can cope with the reality of the world and the condition we find ourselves in. So that's just something I wanted to mention. Now, I love another concept that she utilizes called the understory. And again, I think this is a counterintuitive idea, but the understory is this compelling idea that there's always a deeper reason for why there is conflict. So she uses real examples of people in the world who have had conflict, and there's basically the high conflict. And by the way, just to make a distinction, the high conflict is different from conflict. Conflict might be healthy and normal, but the high conflict is when it becomes extreme and leads more to violence and disruption in society and the social fabric. So definitely want to clarify that. But basically it's interesting because she uses the example of Gary Friedman, who was definitely someone who had conflict when he was in his homeland. And he ended up creating adversaries, even though he was the person who had pioneered this idea in law called mediation law, I believe was the correct term. And this is where you actually, instead of seeing each other as adversaries, you try to work together. So this was especially important with like divorce cases, but really important in any kind of case that might come up. Gary Friedman was the individual who was looking at it from the perspective of not being opposed to each other, of not seeing yourself as adversaries. And I just think it's interesting because then he falls for the same traps, and when he's running for political office ends up making the same errors that people make that lead to high conflict in the first place. It really is remarkable. I encourage you to look up Amanda Ripley on YouTube and check it out for yourself or read the book. But the point is that it's very interesting because the understory is the reason for the conflict, and so this is what we're trying to figure out. What are the real reasons for why the conflict is happening? Gary Friedman thinks it's for superficial reasons, such as people are just contentious and, you know, they're very outdated in their beliefs. But there's always a deeper reason. There's always a deeper undercurrent. And I think part of how we do this is something that Amanda Ripley talks about as well, which is just being able to look at it from the perspective of curiosity. Have curiosity. Don't shut ideas down. Don't shut it down just because that's what it feels like. Try to look at it from the perspective of curiosity and what you can learn from the situation. And so, even though the point is that we can disagree with people, and in fact we should disagree with people, we're really trying to get to the root of where the high conflict comes from. And I think we can do that by understanding the understory. And I actually would like to read the definition of the understory, just to give you a little bit more context, because I think she does a good job describing this term, and I think it's really helpful. So, for instance, she says, what is the crock pot really about? It's hard to get anywhere until you start talking about the understory of any conflict. And so, I think that nails it. I think there's another idea that I wanted to communicate, which is what she also talks about with complicating the narrative, which is basically just being able to complicate the narrative that you find yourself in. What are the other points of view? What are the opposing points of view? What are the things that you don't want to look at that you might want to that are related to the story? What are the other elements of the story? And I love this because when I think of literature, that's what I've always loved about literature, specifically literature like stories, novels, fiction. And that's the whole point, is that you look at it from the perspective of what are the stories and what are all the angles of the stories that are being told, and using the specific word of narrative that she uses and that I like to use in my own discussions. And I think it's fascinating to think about. So complicating the narrative is pretty much understanding the conflict that you might be in, leaning into it, and then instead of running away, fighting, or staying silent, you lean into it. It involves challenging your preconceptions and the things you already believe about a given situation. It involves realizing that there's more to the narrative and that there's a lot more that is going on. And of course, like I said, looking at the opposing viewpoints and looking at the larger narrative that is unfolding. So yeah, I do want to make one final comment. Like I said, I had some critiques of this, some of which I've shared. But I think one of the biggest critiques I wanted to share is that when I look at journalism, or when I look at nonfiction about journalism, or even nonfiction in general that describes very difficult, often politically charged situations that do lead to high conflict in reality, that often lead to violence, you know, warfare, bloodshed. These things are very real. And I love that she's able to talk about it in such a candid way because I think it's important. And I think that's the mark of good journalism, is when you're able to capture that. I do think the thing that I struggle with, though, is that a lot of her ideas feel like counterintuitive. They're not really easy to implement. And I think a good example of this is like, how do you complicate the narrative when you're part of a culture and you can't see outside of that culture? When you're part of a society and you can't look outside of that society? I also look at it from the perspective, like I said earlier, about looping, which is with looping, it's like, How do you learn how to practice that? You have to have people model it so you can see it. You're not always just going to be able to do it on your own. How many people are going to be willing to take on the work for themselves, to be able to challenge themselves, to look for understanding, to try to deal with conflict in a healthier way? So I do think she's done a good job laying the foundation and describing all of these things. But I do think another piece of it is that the more that I look at it, the more I also think it does feel a little bit like, I guess, and I know that this isn't the best term to use and I don't like the baggage, but it kind of feels a little bit like activism. Like, and that's good, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially in something like journalism where things are politically charged. I just feel like we have to be realistic about the world we live in. While I think it's good to challenge ourselves, and I think that's the point of this book, and absolutely do so, I also look at it from the perspective of, like, what about the things that are we just don't understand? What about the things that we can't change? And it's not necessarily to take a self-defeatist approach. I've often talked to people who are very much activist types who have reminded me not to be self-defeatist in my approach, and I totally understand. But the more that I look at it, the more I think, when I think of all of the case studies that she uses in this book to describe high conflict, I almost wonder if that really could have gone another way. I think people can certainly learn, and I think that's her point, is that people can get out of high conflict. But when you're talking about these extreme situations in politics and government and in society and civilization, that can be really difficult. And it's not so much to even critique it, really, because I don't necessarily question the actual techniques and strategies. It's just to say I think a lot of what she's presenting is counterintuitive. I think that's a reason to explore it, but I also think that that is definitely what makes it difficult. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope that you like this discussion on high conflict. I hope you'll check out the book. Thank you for watching. I hope that you'll check out my videos, my books, and yeah, I will see you soon, and thank you for watching.